But just to give you some, really basic idea, just so we're all on the same page of how housing co-ops are different from a financing point of view from either single-family homes or condos. So I got this slide years and years ago from someone at the National Co-op Bank, and I keep using it because I haven't found a better one. So, but we just start with everyone's pretty familiar with this idea of single-family home ownership in America. So maybe you put 10% down, and or I guess in the last few you could put 98, put 2% in, or now maybe they make you have 30%. I don't know, but whatever. You put a percent down, and then you borrow the rest, and that's how you finance your home. So if you do a condo, each individual unit is a separate piece of real estate, and people, they have different amounts of equity. They live there a different amount of time. They have different lenders. So you have all kinds of varied amounts of equity in those homes or debt, and that debt is all individual based on the household that owns that unit. So housing co-ops in general, you have a number of options, and again, like the other things, one of the defining features of co-ops is how flexible they are. So in a housing co-op, and this does have to be modified under California laws. Karen was talking about there's some restrictions on the blanket debt for certain kinds of co-ops. So you might have a hard time finding, or harder time finding bank blanket debt, but you still can. And each member, so you can have one option where there's some amount of blanket debt. So blanket debt is like a blanket across the whole co-op. It means a co-op is a corporation borrows that money on behalf of everybody. And so a co-op, you can have some amount of debt that you all share. You can have some amount, you could have, and again, this doesn't work for a limited equity co-op. This would be a stock co-op, but that would require members to put in, a lot of equity, and maybe they would borrow it with a share loan. In housing co-ops, borrowing money to purchase your share in a housing co-op is called a share loan. And so in markets where those exist, and there are some share loan financiers in California, and we used to do this at our credit union. We used to do this kind of share loan. So anyway, you can have both blanket debt, and you can have individual equity, and you can have individual debt. So you can have some combination of those. So you can, a housing co-op, a market, and again, that would be a stock co-op in California, can just look just like a condo. Every individual unit, it's market rate. You find your own money, you borrow money from somebody, maybe you put in debt, maybe you don't, and it looks just like a condo. The other thing is you could have an option where it's virtually all blanket debt. It's virtually all debt that you hold together as an organization and not individual. And this references HUD Section 213. HUD used to have a lot of, several really great programs for affordable housing co-ops, which have been discontinued. But one that does still exist is this Section 213. It's not specifically in affordable housing. It's just a long-term fixed-rate mortgage for cooperative housing. And it was been used a lot in Minnesota for I spoke of, we have a number, 60 or 70 senior housing co-ops, and lots of them use this HUD program for blanket debt. It's kind of complicated to go through all the hoops as with any government program, but it's fixed rate, long-term, 40-year financing, and we'll do up to 98% of the cost. So it's a pretty good deal in that sense.
What are the rates?
It depends on they're. I don't know. When we did it, they were probably slightly above regular conventional mortgage rates, but not a lot. I mean, so basically good, not a commercial rate. I mean, a lower than that.
Compare them to conventional rates.
They were good. I mean, and there's fees and this and that, but basically it was a good deal.
Was there a limit from requirement?
It's not. No. No, it can be any co-op. It's interesting, and in fact, it's a little hard. You can't do really deep affordable housing with it because they actually require that each member, have a certain amount of money to be able to, argue that they can make the monthly assessment. So like when we used it on a housing co-op, we were kind of the opposite. We were arguing with HUD. We wanted to be more affordable than they wanted us to be. But anyway, it's definitely worth checking out. So you can do a housing co-op. You can do it with each individual debt. You can do it with all blanket debt. You can do it with some combination of debt. And they're going to talk about this later in the example, where there's specifically some blanket debt and some secondary debt and some grant money and some equity. So there's 4 layers of financing. You can do that too. So what I just want to talk a little bit about from the development process, and doing a development from the ground up is a little bit, in some ways doing a co-op development from the ground up is the same as doing, another kind of housing. I mean, you're building it, and so the development process in terms of the real estate process is fairly similar. And the challenge really comes with the co-op aspect, both in terms of the financing and in terms of what you're going to put in place to support that board going forward. But in terms of a conversion, which is what we did the most of, what do you want to, if you're looking to say, okay, here's whatever, it's either an apartment building that's maybe going to be sold, or it might be a housing co-op that was previously funded with a HUD loan, and that loan is coming due, so the apartment might be sold, or something else is going to happen to it, or you're going to in some other way convert an existing house to a house or a building of some sort to a housing co-op. So what do you look for? Like, what does that deal look like? And the three sort of elements of all of this is sort of the able and willing seller, able and willing buyer, and feasibility in terms of what the condition of the property is and how can you make it affordable. And we used this a lot when we were doing mobile home. In fact, that's where this came from, our mobile home park co-op slides. But it's kind of, if you're looking at something like, for example, an apartment, like let's make this into an affordable housing co-op. I mean, the seller has to be able to, make the property available at, some affordable or at least, financeable rate. And this is really depends a lot on the market. I mean, in California, you probably can't ever do this without subsidy. In other markets that are less expensive, you can actually do conversions to affordable housing just with regular commercial debt because the properties just aren't that expensive. One of the things about the co-op, and this is certainly true if you're creating a co-op with existing residents in place, or in some other way have resident involvement in that development process. Some even co-op developers, they just do the whole thing and then they come get residents. So the residents don't have anything to do with the property development. That's how the senior housing co-ops in Minneapolis, which were done by for-profit developers, were done. So they really are developed very conventionally. But most people who want to do a co-op, they're either working with an individual base of people that already live in the, either in the community or live in the property. And so you've got this group of residents who are kind of involved in this idea of, can we buy this property and turn it into a co-op? So, and usually that just takes some time. I mean, co-ops take some time to have the meetings and to do this and do that. So generally speaking, you need a seller that's going to at least have a little patience with this investigation period that's going to take more time because you're going to involve more people. Yeah.
And the MAP Act goes into there?
I'm totally not, your California legal expert, but I mean, yeah, you'd have to follow all the regulations.
I mean, because that's what they're saying. If you're gonna take, this is generally gonna be apartments,
yeah,
some kind of, that you're gonna, instead of condominium, you'll cooperate that.
Right, exactly. So you'd be like in San Francisco, you'd be on the list to see if you could do that conversion or whatever. Yeah, you'd be under the same regulation. So that would be an additional layer. And so it really does, doing the co-op, because if you are going to include residents in that development process, take some time and, to bring people along. The seller has to be willing to give some information about the history of the property and, have a process where people, are really kind of walking through that and understanding what the implications of doing this as a co-op and as an ownership project is going to be. And so, there certainly are cases you could do it. I mean, we did a mobile home park co-op where the seller was like getting indicted by the state attorney general for various nefarious things. So he was a very unwilling seller, but it is extraordinarily difficult to do it with an unwilling seller. I mean, every single corner, he just wouldn't do this, or he wouldn't produce his paper, or he wouldn't, whatever. So it was very difficult. It made it much more risky for the people involved because they did a transaction with much less information than we really would want them to have. So the buyer is the co-op. So here's, how can you tell? It's this group of people, they kind of want to co-op or they're sort of interested. And this is like part of the art of the whole deal. I mean, certainly residents need to be interested. Do residents have the capacity to be co-op owners? My personal opinion is, almost anybody has the capacity to be a good co-op members. But as a group, they have to have capacity too. They have to be able to work together, or at least have some kind of, base, not hostile relationship. And the commitment, at least a core group of residents have to be kind of involved if they're going to be part of this development process. Are they going to volunteer for acquisitions or be an interim board of director or some other way? Put in some fairly good amount of time and learning time, on behalf of this idea, which we don't, know if we're going to be able to make it work out. So, it's kind of a difficult process in that sense, because you're saying, well, we have this dream or this idea, we want to do, and we're trying to figure out if we can get this done and bring people along in that process, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, unfortunately. Mostly I'm thinking of an existing property that people are already there, but you would, if you were doing a new thing, I mean, co-ops are not exempt from any fair housing, thing, but you could, as I was saying earlier, if you have a community of interest, we're going to start an artists co-op, you can start with that group, and in fact, we have a number of artist co-ops in the Twin Cities, and they came out of an arts nonprofit. I mean, that's the core group. So the group of residents were members of the arts nonprofit that had been working with, which wasn't a housing development to begin with. They did other kinds of arts projects. So, that happened. Yeah.
How long? Typical 3 to 5 years?
It can take a long time, yeah.
Like that?
Yeah.
Not
sometimes.
less than, what, 2 years?
No, sometimes it can be less than 2 years. I mean, in some of the parks, if it's up for sale, you just go and do it. It could be really short. But this is all kind of part of I can't, if X number of people come to a meeting or whatever, it's hard to say, but there does have to be some kind of core, interest and ability to get along for that residents group. Because if everybody's all factionalized already and you have to fight that as well as try and do the co-op, it's too difficult in my opinion. And it doesn't work. So, and there's also all the same issues you have in real estate, which is a condition of the property. I mean, is a property in the right shape? Is it either in good enough shape, or are there funds available that could improve it to the level that would be acceptable? And can the project sustain itself after, and the helper agent would be, the nonprofit or whoever is the developer that's trying to help you do this, launches the purchase. So what's the long-term kind of financial feasibility of it look like? And there's a lot of challenges in doing co-op. I mean, there's a reason that for-profit developers don't do this all the time. And at least if it's a lot of these mobile home parks were just really funky properties. I mean, they just passed from these hands for private people and never saw the light of day. And they had I can't even begin to tell you the weird things that were wrong with this property, including people building all over property that wasn't theirs, or on roads, or this or that. And I mean, the weirdest one was some guy who was, when, I don't know how they found this, when they dug down, he had, for being cheap, there was some piping for water for the homes, and he ran out of piping, or he didn't want to do it, but he was using old light post. He welded together, he bought it for a deal, old light posts, and welded them together and buried them in the ground, and was running people's water through them, and the city they were like, oh my God, what a huge liability. So you never know, these guys that own the parks, they'll do anything, they really will. It's just unbelievable. We were really surprised, and again, I'm talking we did one apartment co-op, but mostly we did mobile home park co-ops. I was really surprised at the resistance from people you would think, potential partners, nonprofits and stuff, were really a little edgy about the democracy thing a lot of the time, and particularly the lower income you go, the more edgy they get about, can these people really control their own housing? And so I would just found really disappointing because of course, with appropriate training and support, which everybody needs to be a good board member, pretty much anyone can be a good co-op member, in my opinion. But so I was surprised. I mean, just people I thought would be really on board for this idea weren't necessarily. So we had to do a lot of education. Co-ops are still a pretty innovative model, so it's hard to get money from some conventional sources, even when there's interest. And Kim has a good list, and I think it's exactly right to put it in. Absolutely know what a co-op is, have done it before, but may not know they've done it before, should know how to do it, but maybe they don't know that they know how to do it, so it's not the most usual thing, but California's pretty good. There's a lot of good, we heard, 3 nice, good functional co-ops. They're around, and so you just have an education thing to do. Property management is always a challenge. Most property managers do not know how to respect and deal with a resident board. They really don't. That's not part of their DNA. Not part of their training. And it's really too bad, because they really do. It's very different to have a board of owners than a board of residents, and the property management really needs to understand that and support that.
Do people ever make their own property management?
Yes, they do. They do. Sometimes they just hire an employee. In New York City, one of my other favorite developers, they just have, the nonprofit has a development company that is where people are trained to be, to deal with resident-owned boards in a respectful and productive way. I talked about this a little bit, this idea of developing potential versus managing expectations. And HCD and LCD, it's the highest common denominator, the lowest common denominator. And really, people come together at one or the other or someplace in between. And I find this really challenging because you can tell I love co-ops. But personally, like if I'm talking to a co-op group, I have to weigh, dampen my enthusiasm and can think about managing expectations because it is really hard. I mean, it's a challenge. It's a good challenge in a lot of ways, and people are in skills and all that other stuff, but it's not the easiest. I think all of our panelists would agree, there's probably easier things you could do in the world than be on your co-op board and contribute to your community, but, it's a good thing to do. So that's just part of the challenge of trying to create the excitement or, what the potential is versus some of these other challenges that we know are going to happen, which is people don't understand it. They may not trust that you, the co-op board, have the ability to do your job. So you have to fight for your ability to do your job. And, even lenders don't necessarily understand, even ones that should. And we dealt with a number of situations where there are a lot of Spanish speakers in the parks. And so you have an additional layer of cultural language, distrust or not knowing, who each other is. And in the best possible world, the co-op's the place everybody comes together, but it's really easy in those cases for the factions to develop on the board. And so you have to be very, very careful of that and inclusive and translate everything and just be really creating that expectation that the board is a very different kind of place where we've all got a common enterprise. So I think there's lots of opportunities in this, though. I think it's very compelling work. It's really, when they work, they are the most beautiful thing. Lots of opportunities for win-win for a seller of a property and for a community where, it's like everybody, the people get to be homeowners. They keep a property, maybe upkeep it more. I mean, there's lots of good things that happen. Creating more homeowners, preserving affordable housing, asset development. If you have those formulas in the home and the community. And I actually consider co-ops a community asset. I think they're really good for communities. I think it's important. And I think that's true across the board in all kinds of communities. I love student housing co-ops. People are like, why students, they just come and go. But it's so much better than, the kind of crappy housing that students live in. I mean, it's so much better for a university community and relationships if you have students living in co-ops than if you just had them living in, crappy housing, rental housing or something. So best practices are next. So I think we're going to start the finance panel now. Is that right? Okay.